Welcome back to the second of our three lectures on the historical books that are part of the Deuteronomistic history. We've already spent some time with Joshua and Judges. In this lecture, we will do Samuel before doing the books of 1st and 2nd Kings in the following lecture. Once again, I'm going to refer you to your assigned readings for most of the historical background information that you need to be aware of. I think it's easier to pick a lot of that up by reading rather than by lecture. And I'm going to focus my comments largely on literary and theological matters, showing how the way in which the text has been constructed emphasizes the theological themes and concerns of the Deuteronomistic historian. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel pick up where the book of Judges leaves off. And so we're in that period of time before the monarchy. And the first 15 chapters of Samuel are going to talk about the end of the pre-monarchical period, the ministry of Samuel, the rise of the monarchy, and the reign of Saul. Okay, and then beginning with chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, we're going to start to talk about the rise of David, and we're going to see the ways in which he is eventually going to be anointed king. And then when we get into 2 Samuel, immediately following the death of Saul, David is finally going to take the throne and consolidate his reign. And then the rest of 2 Samuel will be concerned with the question of events that happened during the reign of David, finally leading up to the question of who is going to succeed him. In this presentation, there are going to be three issues that I'm going to focus on. The first is going to be the rise of the monarchy in the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel. The second issue we'll look at will be the rise of Samuel, or the rise of David, rather, beginning in 1 Samuel 16 and going through 2 Samuel 7. And then third, I will make a couple of final concluding remarks, attempting to set this literature in the context of the Old Testament itself. So then let's go back and get started with the issue of the rise of the monarchy, which, like we said, takes place in 1 Samuel 1 through 15. You'll remember that at the end of the book of Judges, we said we have that phrase, there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. We also saw that throughout the period of Joshua and Judges, there are some problems that come because there is no centralized authority. There is no one single leader that has the ability to call all the tribes to battle, to fight their wars for them, and to be their leader. In the midst of all this uncertainty and all this threat, we're going to see that the Israelites are going to think that finally having one leader with the power to fight against the enemy and with the power to tell them how to escape danger is going to be the ticket to getting rid of this anxiety that they've been facing. The first part of the book is going to talk about the life and the ministry of Samuel. Samuel kind of functions as the transitional figure between the time of the monarchy and the time of the judges. He is going to be acting as the last of the judges. He is going to be the religious priest at the shrine of Shiloh. He is going to be the first prophet, and he is going to be the one who is finally going to announce the coming of Saul to the throne and who will give the people the monarchy, even though he is going to have some difficulties with that himself. The beginning of Samuel's ministry in chapters 1 to 3 is going to describe the well-known story of Samuel growing up at the temple at Shiloh under the priest Eli, and we will see why that was. Chapter 3, which tells about the call of Samuel, is especially significant because it suggests that there had been a period of time when the Israelites for quite a while had not been hearing revelations from God, and now all of a sudden again through the person of Samuel they do. And so Samuel again becomes like a judge and a prophet who is able to have communication with the Lord. At the beginning of chapter 3, it begins, the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was there, rare in those days, and visions were not widespread. After his vision in the temple, and at the end of the chapter, the verse will describe, as Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord, and the word of Samuel came to all Israel. So this passage really functions in large measure as a way of saying that Samuel is a prophet, and after a long drought of hearing revelations from Yahweh, the Israelites finally have someone that can give them those revelations that they need. Of course, the other part of what we are told in this story in chapter 3 is that Eli's sons have been wicked, and they are no longer able to function as priests. They are not able to succeed their father, and so God has chosen Samuel as their replacement. In chapters 4 to 6, we get the first part of what is often called the ark narrative. This is something that occurs in a battle that the Israelites are having with the Philistines, where they take the ark out into battle. The Philistines capture the ark and they take it back and put it into the temple of their own God. But as you'll remember, 2 different times their God essentially bows down before this ark, and so they send it back to Israel, and the oxen take the ark back to Israel, leaving their young behind, thus proving that God is the one who is behind Israel and is giving them the victory. The capture of the ark is something that would have been completely typical of ancient Near Eastern kings and nations at that time. Anytime one country defeated another, they would often try to capture the statue or the image of the nation that they had been defeated and take that statue or image back home to where they live and perhaps put it back in their temple. Of course, with the Israelites, there was no image or statue of Yahweh allowed, and so it's the ark that is taken as the holy object. The ark narrative comes to an end at the end of chapter 6, having demonstrated again God's role in being with the Israelites and in caring about their fate. And then in 1 Samuel 7, we're going to move on to a description of some of Samuel's activity as a judge. We've seen that so far Samuel functions as a prophet who receives the word of God. He seems to function as a priest and has probably taken the place of Eli in performing the priestly duties at Shiloh. And now he's going to function as a judge as well. He's going to be one of the early circuit riders. He's going to go around from place to place and probably rendering decisions and governing the people at each of these towns where he goes. Also, as well, at one point, Samuel is going to offer up burnt offerings when the Philistines are about to attack. And this is going to draw upon God's help and assistance in helping the Israelites defeat these enemies as they are invading. Soon, however, Samuel loses the confidence of those people who are under him, and particularly because Samuel's sons also are not fit for the job of succeeding him. The Israelites are also concerned about the continuing threat of the Philistines, and this is where they are going to desire a more centralized authority who is going to be able to be their savior and lead them out to battles. And so in chapter 8, the Israelites are going to come to Samuel and ask him to appoint for them a king. After chapter 8, verse 3 describes the downfallings of Samuel's son, the elders of Israel get together and do something that would probably seem to most of us to be a fairly reasonable thing to do. They come to Samuel, and in verse 5, they say to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations." However, we're going to see that Samuel does not reply positively to this request. It tells us that the thing displeased Samuel, and Samuel prays to the Lord, and the Lord tells Samuel in verse 7, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being a king over them." In other words, here in chapter 8, the idea of a monarchy is seen as anathema to God. It is a rejection of God's authority. It is as if they are asking for somebody to replace God. Samuel, it seems, is almost trying to suggest, no, the Lord is your king, and now that you want a human king, it is the same as rejecting or abandoning the Lord. Samuel is then going to go on to warn the people about how the king will treat them. And so in verses 11 through 16 and 17 and 18, it says he is going to be abusive of the people. He is going to take them and force them to work for him. He's going to take a lot of what they produce and do a lot of other things in his abusive power that are very similar to what happens during the time of Solomon. Even then, however, the people are not convinced. And so they tell Samuel in verse 19, no, but we are determined to have a king over us. And so finally the Lord says in verse 22, listen to their voice and set a king over them. Samuel said to the people of Israel, each of you return home. Now the story about Samuel's rise to the kingship is going to continue in the following chapters. In verse 9, it's going to have the story about Saul being out looking for his uncle, or his father's rather, lost donkeys, and they come to Samuel because they know that he has a reputation for being able to have contact with the supernatural world and answer questions. And so they go to Samuel, who is called this man of God. And as Saul is approaching, God tells Samuel to anoint him as the next king of Israel. The story, which goes through the 8th verse of chapter 10, is interesting because nowhere does it give a negative evaluation or a negative opinion of the idea of a monarchy or kingship as we saw in chapter 8. Here it seems like a perfectly normal thing that God is the one who has come up with this plan from the first and tells Saul that he is going to be the one to anoint, or tells Samuel rather that he is going to be the one to anoint Saul. Now beginning in chapter 10, verses 17 through 27, we're going to have another account of Saul being anointed as king by Samuel. This case, all the tribes are brought forward by Lot, and finally Saul's tribe, Benjamin, is chosen, and from the clans of that tribe, eventually Saul is identified by Lot as the king. This story contains one negative reference to the idea of a kingship in verse 19, where Samuel repeats to the people basically the same thing he had told them in 1 Samuel 8, that by asking for a king, you have rejected the Lord. However, for the most part, in the rest of this chapter, there is really not any negative evaluation of the idea of the monarchy, so it may be that verses 17 through 19 were added later on in the editorial process. One more story about Saul being identified as king begins in chapter 10, the second half of verse 27, and then moving on into chapter 11, going through the 15th verse of that chapter. Here, it is going to show that Saul is identified as king by an act of military heroism. He is going to lead the citizens of Jabesh Gilead to war against the Ammonites, against this terrible king Nahash, who is threatening to cut out the eyes of everybody who will not follow him as king. At this point, Saul leads them into battle, wins the battle, and he is seen as being the hero and certainly the person you'd want to be a king. Once again, not really in this story a negative evaluation of the idea of kingship. Samuel's last major speech in the book is going to come in chapter 12. And in this speech, once again, there is a very negative evaluation of the idea of the monarchy. So as Samuel gives his concluding speech, he presents Saul to them, and he tells them, beginning in chapter 12, verse 13, see, here is the king whom you have chosen, for whom you have asked. See, the Lord has set a king over you. He goes on to say that even though you've asked for a king, there is still hope. If you fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not heed the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. So in other words, he tells them whether or not things go well with this new monarchy is going to be up to you, and it's going to be based on the decisions you make and the behavior you exhibit in your relationship with God. There is a thunderstorm that comes now and a heavy rain, which is often a sign of God's displeasure or a sign of warning in the Old Testament. And then beginning in verse 19, the people will say to Samuel that asking him to pray to God on their behalf. Pray to the Lord your God for your servants, so that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins the evil of demanding a king for yourselves. Saul just goes on essentially to tell them, obey the Lord, and if you do so, it will be all right. The Lord will not cast away his people for his great name's sake. In other words, God will keep his promise to you. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, and will instruct you in the good and right way. Most scholars think that what happens here is that we have the intermingling of at least two different ancient sources. We've got several different accounts suggesting several different ways of how Saul was identified as the people's king. In some instances, the kingship is identified as a negative. In other parts of the story, it's identified as a positive. And so most scholars think that we're probably both positive and negative stories about the monarchy that have been brought together and intermingled into the final form of the text as we have it by the editors. In the next 3 chapters, however, we're going to see that Saul's reign is far from successful. We're going to see at least 2 stories where he forfeits the right to maintain the monarchy in his line of descendants because of his own act of disobedience. The first instance is in chapter 13. Saul is getting ready to fight a battle against the Philistines. He and Samuel have made an agreement that he is supposed to wait for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice before commencing to fight. Offering that kind of sacrifice to the God right before a battle and gaining the God's approval, of course, would have been extremely important back in those days for any ancient Near Eastern nation. However, as the Philistines are drawing closer and getting ready to fight, and Samuel has not yet come, Saul loses courage, he loses faith, and instead he undertakes to offer the sacrifice himself. Just as he does this, Samuel comes and says to Saul in verse 13, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he has commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be the ruler over his people." In chapter 14, Saul's leadership of the army is going to continue. It's going to talk about some more battles against the Philistines. And then in chapter 15, we're going to have one more story about Saul losing the right to the kingship because of his own disobedience. In this case, it's pertaining to a battle with the Amalekites. As they are going out to fight the battle, Saul has been told that he is supposed to completely exterminate everybody and everything and all animals, but instead he violates the ban that were part of the Holy War or Yahweh War requirements. He saves the king of Amalek and he saves some of the animals. When Samuel comes and confronts him about that, Saul offers the excuse that I was just going to use these animals as a sacrifice to Yahweh. But then Samuel responds to him in a well-known passage beginning in verse 22 of chapter 15. "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obedience to the voice of the Lord? Surely to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is no less a sin than divination, and stubbornness is like iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." Saul then apologizes to Samuel, asks for forgiveness, asks Samuel to pray for forgiveness, but Samuel assures him that God is not going to change his mind about this decision. From there, we move to the second big part of the books of Samuel, the second major section, which is the rise of David. From here on out, we're going to be looking toward David as the next king, beginning already in 1 Samuel 16, where Samuel goes to Bethlehem to anoint David as the next king. You remember the story about how David is going to be the youngest son, and yet he is going to be the one whom God has appointed to be the next king, and he's the one that Samuel is instructed by him to anoint. During the rest of the book of 1 Samuel, we're going to see that David is going to be on the run from King Saul. As you can imagine, Saul is not very happy, and in fact, he is incensed that there is somebody else here, David, that has been appointed as king. And so during much of the rest of the book, he is trying to chase David, trying to run him down, and trying to kill him. And so we have this very interesting story going throughout much of the rest of the book about David going about through the land and even into the Philistine territory, trying to hide from Saul and save his own life. What's interesting is that in the stories of this running from Saul, the author is very careful to point out that David did not want to, nor did he try to kill Saul. In fact, he is trying to make it crystal clear that David has no blood on his hands for Saul's death. In both chapters 24 and 26 of 1 Samuel, we see an instance where David has the opportunity to put Saul to death, and he turns it down. Finally, Saul is going to die in the last chapter of 1 Samuel when he is fighting a battle against the Philistines. In chapter 21, it notes that the Philistines come and attack Saul, and they kill his 3 sons, including Jonathan. Saul asks his armor bearer to kill him. The armor bearer refuses to do this, and so Saul, in verse 4 of chapter 31, takes his own sword and falls upon it. And so 1 Samuel 31 ends kind of like a Shakespeare play does, with all of the major characters lying dead on the stage. This then leaves the way clear for David to be anointed as king. Let's turn the page to 2 Samuel and see how that plays itself out. We will notice that in this first chapter of 2 Samuel, a messenger comes from the battlefield and tells King David, or tells David about the death of Saul. David asks him how things went, and he says the army fled, and also many of the army fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan also died. David says, how do you know Saul and Jonathan are dead? And the young messenger says, I was there, essentially. Saul was leaning on his spear. He looked behind him. He saw me and called to me, and I answered, here, sir. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. He said to me, come stand over me and kill me, for convulsions have seized me and my life still lingers. And so in verse 10, the messenger says, I stood over him and killed him, for I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. Now we have just read that that's not how it happened. We've just read that Saul fell on his own sword, but yet here this messenger comes and tells David, Saul was about to die, so I finished him off. Why do you think that this messenger would claim to have killed Saul when he did not? I think the answer is found in the second half of verse 10. He says, I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. So here we have this messenger who is coming and essentially telling David, I have cleared the way for you to become the king. I killed your primary competitor, and here I have brought you the crown. No doubt he was expecting a very handsome reward, perhaps expecting a high place in the kingdom, but instead, what does David do? David has him put to death. David says to him, were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Now, the reference to not killing the Lord's anointed is an echo of 1 Samuel 24 and 26. Those other 2 instances where David had the chance to kill Saul, but he did not. And so you see the editors of this material are very, very careful to show that David has no blood on his hands whatsoever in the death of Saul. A lot of people have suggested that perhaps there were rumors going around that David was involved in Saul's death, that David had assassinated him. Some historians have even gone so far as to speculate that David even did have something to do with his death. But in either case, it seems that there were a lot of people saying that David did, which is probably why the editor of this book makes sure to clarify as much as he can that David was in no way, shape, or form responsible for the death of Saul. Probably the reason he decides that these stories should be included in his history. Nevertheless, in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, David is going to go to Hebron and he's going to meet all of the tribes of Judah, and once again he is going to be anointed king. His first anointing was privately by the prophet Samuel in Bethlehem. Now here his second anointing is publicly by all the people of Judah in Hebron. However, we see that at this point the acclamation of David as king is not unanimous. People from the northern kingdom instead want Saul's son Ishbaal to be their king, and so they announce him as king. And the next few chapters are going to tell about an interesting civil war that has to take place between David and Ishbaal, the forces of David and the forces of Ishbaal. The Battle of Gibeon in chapter 2, beginning with verse 12, tells about some hand-to-hand combat to the death, kind of a tournament, which helps determine all this. Finally, in chapter 4, Ishbaal is going to be assassinated in his own house. At this point, David is going to put to death the people who had assassinated his opponent, Ishbaal. Once again, the author wants to emphasize that David has no blood on his hands for the death of Saul or for anybody associated with Saul's house. Nevertheless, that becomes the end of the competition, so to speak, and so at the beginning of chapter 5, David is anointed for the third time, this time in Hebron, and this time by the people of Israel, the name given to the northern tribes. And so by chapter 5, David has now consolidated his reign among all of the tribes. They all agree to follow him, and this arrangement, where both of the nations are united under one king, will last for about 100 years, or perhaps a little less from now, probably till about 922, when once again they will split apart. So probably the North and the South were never really saw themselves as solidly a single nation, but rather it is that David and Solomon were able to hold on to both of them through their leadership capabilities and through the power of their personality, perhaps, until the kingdom is going to split off again in 922. In any case, now that David has finally taken the kingship, he's going to do what any good king would do. He's going to take his capital and establish it. He first captures Jerusalem in chapter 5, kicks out the Jebusites, so to speak, and establishes it as his capital, which he had moved from farther south from the city of Hebron. This is a very astute political move, scholars say, because Jerusalem was right on the border between the north and the south, or at least fairly close to the border. And so David, by moving to Jerusalem, is probably hoping that neither the south nor the north can claim that they are the favored nation because they have the king. David perhaps wants to make a point that he is the king of both the north and the south. Indeed, as well, it may be that David didn't completely trust those northern tribes who had originally wanted Ishbaal to be their king, and so perhaps by being close to the border in Jerusalem, he feels he can better keep an eye on them. In any case, this is an astute political move, and so he establishes his capital, and then the next thing he's going to do in chapter 6 is going to move his ark up to the capital. Chapter 6 is kind of a continuation of that ark narrative that we saw in 1 Samuel chapters 4 to 6. And so now he will move his ark up to the temple in Jerusalem, or to the place where the temple will eventually be, I should say. And again, this is something that any king would do, is probably move a statue of their god and establish their capital and their religious center together to demonstrate that they have the god on their side. And so that is what David is doing here. Okay, let's go on now and spend a little bit of time on 2 Samuel 7. This is one of the key passages in all of the Old Testament, the famous passage where David is told by God, given a promise by God, that his descendants will rule on the throne forever. It starts when Nathan and David are talking. The king is settled in his house. It tells us the Lord had given him rest from his enemies all around, and the king indicates to Nathan the prophet that he would like to build a house or a temple for God. Again, this is typical of the way things went back in the day in the ancient Near East. A king, before he started a major building project such as a temple, would have always asked some kind of a prophet or diviner to make sure that he has the God's approval for doing it. At first, Nathan says, yes, go ahead and do what you have to do, but that night, the word of the Lord comes to Nathan, and he is given a different message to reply to David. God tells him, I've not lived in the house since the day I brought the people up to Egypt from this day. When did I ever ask you, why have you not built a house for me? In verse 8, he goes on to tell Nathan, thus you shall say to my servant David, I took you from the pasture and from following the sheep to be prince over my people. And so he goes on to tell him more about what he has done and more about what he will do for him. Perhaps part of this is from the Deuteronomistic editors before we get into the old oracle again in chapter 7, verse 11b, and going through verse 17, which is the core of the promise now that God is making to David. So let's take a look at what he says. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. So here we see this play on the words house. Earlier on, David had wanted to make a house for God in the sense of a temple. God declines that offer and now tells David, I will make you a house, meaning house in the sense of a dynasty. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down from your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. So we are talking now about Solomon. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. The word forever is crucial here. It is going to be used 2 more times in the passage. In verse 14, God says, I will be like a father to him, and he will be a son to me. Giving the name son between God and king is typical in the ancient Near East. And then God will say, when he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, but with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. In other words, Saul suffered the loss of his kingdom because what he had done. I will, however, never take the kingdom away from your son, from your family, from your line. I will punish him with attacks from human beings, from other armies, but I will not take the kingdom away from him. Verse 16 then repeats the word forever 2 more times. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, and your throne shall be established forever. This key passage in the Old Testament is known as the unconditional promise that God gives to David that there will always be somebody on his throne. This is going to be an important part of the biblical tradition in the rest of the Old Testament as well. We are going to see, for instance, when they get to Isaiah, that when Isaiah begins prophesying to a group of people that are undergoing a great amount of difficulty, when Judah is facing dire threats, what is he going to do? He's going to refer to God's promise to David as the source of reassurance that God is not going to allow his people to be destroyed. And so when the exile comes in 587, that's going to be a major spiritual crisis, a theological crisis, because people are going to be thinking about this promise that God had given to David and wonder what happened. Why did God, in fact, allow that family to be wiped off from the throne and the nation to be destroyed? And as we'll see when we get through reading the Deuteronomistic history, the Israelites are going to come to the conclusion that the exile happens because they had been disobedient to the terms of the covenant of Exodus 19. Nevertheless, they're going to come to see the exile as kind of being a temporary break or a temporary punishment, but they are going to maintain hope that God will still send a Davidic king back to rescue them, to once again lead them, so that the promise of 2 Samuel 7 can continue. And so because kings were anointed, they are going to call this new king that they are looking for to continue the promise the Anointed One, which in Hebrew is known as Messiah. And so by the time of the New Testament writers, The Jews, many of them are still looking for this anointed one, this Messiah. And of course, the New Testament writers are going to explain that this Messiah was the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth. And so what we have here is that together, Exodus 19 and 2 Samuel 7 function as kind of two of the crucial poles, two of the crucial center points around which the rest of the Old Testament revolves. In Exodus 19, we've got God's conditional covenant with the Israelites at Mount Sinai, telling them that they must keep the covenant. And then in 2 Samuel 7, we have got the unconditional promise to David. And we're going to see that different prophets, as we continue, are going to show affinity with different traditions. Some prophets, such as Jeremiah and Hosea, are going to talk a lot about Israel breaking that unconditional covenant by worshiping other gods, and they're going to be associated with the Mount Sinai covenant in Exodus 19. Other prophets, such as Isaiah, are going to focus more of their attention on the promise of a coming Davidic king, like we have in 2 Samuel 7, and they're going to be focused more around this 2 Samuel 7 promise. And so I like to call this a tale of two mountains. A great scholar by the name of John Levinson has wrote a wonderful book called Sinai and Zion, in which he traces kind of these two promise/covenant traditions as they are known throughout the Old Testament. The Sinai tradition, originating in more rural areas and perhaps largely in the north, talking about Moses as a covenant mediator. It's a covenant with an entire people, a conditional covenant. Then the Sinai tradition, the promise that God gives to his people of an unconditional kingship, a relationship or a promise more to a particular family, a royal family, a promise that is unconditional, and a promise that probably emerged out of southern, largely urban environments. So I want you to keep this in mind as we go along now after the lecture on 1st and 2nd Kings. Beginning in the next module, we will head on to Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos, those 8th century prophets, and we will see how they kind of fit into what I can call a tale of two mountains, how they each revolve around one of the covenant promise traditions, either the Sinai covenant or the Zion promise. So I look forward to having you back and can't wait to talk about that with you.